Today is the third Sunday, as I said earlier on, in our mental wellness sermon series. Each Sunday builds upon the previous one. In week 1, we reminded each other of our identity as God's creation and affirmed that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Nothing else in our life defines us as much as our being God's marvelously unique creation. When some part of us falls ill, those things never, ever fully define us. In week 2, we went one step further and focused on living with mental illness. Our guide for week 2 was the story of Jesus healing a man who lived naked and shackled among the tombs. Jesus healed the man and enabled him to return to his community. Although it is impossible to properly diagnose the man's condition, there is a lot that we can learn from this story for our own time, based on what Jesus does and says, and on what he does not do or say. First, we ought to consider the modern diagnostic tools and treatment options as gifts from God for us, gifts that we can use for the betterment of people. Secondly, we must never label people's mental health challenges as a sign of God's punishment or attribute them to a person's inadequate faith. Thirdly, we are invited to follow the example of Jesus and offer community and belonging to stigmatized and outcast people, including those who live with mental illness. Let's now move on to the topic of week 3, stigma. Research shows that stigma is the product of a process with 3 steps: stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. A stereotype is a harmful or negative belief about a group of people. We are constantly exposed to stereotypes through everyday conversations, through the entertainment we view, through the literature we read, and so on. A stereotype becomes a prejudice when we allow harmful or negative beliefs about a group of people to change our own thoughts and feelings about that group. Once we express those negative thoughts and feelings about that group of people through words and deeds, prejudice turns into discrimination. I found this helpful example that describes how the process works. A stereotype. Helen watched a television series where a person living with schizophrenia was portrayed as violent and dangerous. Prejudice. Helen and Jane both have children in the same kindergarten class. Helen feels anxious and alarmed when she learns that Jane experienced symptoms of psychosis prior to being diagnosed with postpartum depression. Discrimination. Helen decides that she will neither befriend Jane nor allow her child to visit with Jane's child anymore, since she does not trust Jane to keep the children safe. Helen also quietly shares her concerns with the other parents. So that's kind of how the process goes. Have you ever heard one of the following sentiments and opinions voiced about people with mental health challenges? They cannot work or hold down a job. People just use mental health challenges as an excuse for poor behavior. Mental health challenges are the result of personal sin. People with mental health challenges are weak. They could snap out of it if they really tried. Ever heard one of those? When individuals with lived experience are exposed to such beliefs, they might blame themselves for their own challenges with their own mental health and begin to think that they really are lazy, sinful, and weak. In other words, what was an external statement, people with mental health challenges are weak, becomes an internal thought. I'm weak. I wouldn't have this issue if I tried harder. If this kind of negative self-talk not only lowers self-esteem, but also prevents people from successfully engaging in the process of recovery. These are examples of self-stigma. Stigma and self-stigma often show up in the language people use to describe someone else's or their own lived experience. Have you ever noticed that mental health utilizes I am language? You would be shocked if a cancer patient declared, I am cancerous. Likewise, people don't say, I'm pneumonia, or I am appendicitis. They say, I have pneumonia, or I was out with appendicitis. Yet when it comes to mental health challenges, I am statements abound. I'm schizophrenic, I'm bipolar, and so on. This phenomenon leads us back to week 1, where we heard that no medical condition ever describes fully who we are. The only attribute that fully describes who we are is that God created us, that we have been fearfully and wonderfully made by God. Sometimes we use language too casually and make statements about other people and ourselves that generalizes and trivializes people's painful experiences. For example, when we say things like, Jane is schizophrenic, Scott is crazy, that person seemed really mentally unstable, the weather is so bipolar. Sorry, that's just my OCD coming out. The first 3 statements, Jane is schizophrenic, Scott is crazy, that person seems mentally unstable, equate people with their mental health challenges. While the last 2 statements, the weather is so bipolar, sorry, that's just my OCD coming out, minimizes the significance of mental disorders. In other words, speaking in these ways reduces human beings to an illness and trivializes very difficult and painful experiences. Sometimes stigma can be perpetuated by what is not said rather than by what is said. When our communities fail to talk about realities like mental health challenges, those realities become unspeakable. David Finnegan Hosey, who works as a chaplain and lives with bipolar disorder, describes his own experience like this. I did not come of age in a faith community that considered depression to be a result of sin. Mental illness was not spoken of as sinful in my home church because, as far as I can remember, it was not really spoken of at all. The stigma and shame of it was not overtly enforced, but rather silently assumed. When I found myself in the psych ward, he says, my immediate assumption was not that I was being punished by God for my sins. I was, however, quite convinced that hospitalization represented a personal failure on my part. So that's what not talking about things can do. In addition to stigma and social stigma, there is structural stigma that negatively impacts people with mental health challenges. For example, your employer or your school may not count mental health episodes as a legitimate reason for a sick day. People with mental health challenges may not be eligible for medical leave. One's health insurance may not cover mental health services. Such policy matters all have negative impact on the employment, finances, healthcare, and recovery of people living with mental health challenges. So those are all examples of structural stigma. So what can Christian communities such as ours do to help erase the stigma surrounding mental illnesses? One of the most important things we can do is use language more carefully. We can make sure that we do not trivialize the experiences, the challenges that people with mental illnesses experience. For example, I may prefer to be organized and approach tasks in a predictable and orderly manner. That does not make my preferences OCD, and I should not refer to them as such. I may want to humorously describe rapid back and forth changes in the weather as bipolar, but doing so trivializes the difficulties of people with bipolar disorders. I can also make sure that I do not equate people's identity with the developmental disorder or the mental health condition that they live with. People live with autism and schizophrenia or anorexia, but those conditions do not define their whole identity. I therefore should not call them autistic or schizophrenic or anorexic, because that labels them. That defines their identity by that adjective. There is a tremendous power in looking beyond medical diagnoses and simply recognizing people for who they are. This was the task that God gave to humanity in the Garden of Eden. The task of seeing and naming things truly. And it remains our task today. The church is called to be a community where the God-given value and dignity of all people is acknowledged and welcomed, and where individuals are known not by diagnosis, but by name. Such truly seeing, naming, welcoming, and accompanying people was at the heart of Jesus' mission and ministry. Nowhere is this seen more clearly than in the Gospel of Luke. Luke tells us that Jesus began his ministry by quoting from the prophet Isaiah and declaring his mission to bring good news to the poor and freedom to the oppressed. From the beginning of his life until the very end, Jesus surrounded himself with outcasts. Luke records many meaningful interactions with Gentiles, women, children, people at the economic margins of society, and sinners, each one representing a different stigmatized group in first century Palestine. And each one is given the gifts of attention, compassion, respect, and healing by Jesus. Take a moment to imagine the shocking sight of an allegedly sinful woman crashing a party filled with religious leaders and weeping in their presence at the feet of Jesus. Then anointing his feet and drying them off with her own hair. Who knows where that hair was before? Or take Matthew, the tax collector, also known by his Jewish name Levi, despised for his collaboration with the Roman occupiers and considered a traitor by his own people. It was this outcast whom Jesus asked to be his disciple. Almost every page of this gospel presents us with a fresh example of Christ's commitment to love each person he encountered, regardless of how they were labeled by society. This commitment led Jesus to the cross, where he surrendered his life as he identified himself with the sin and brokenness of the world. Think of the words that Ernie and Debbie read from Isaiah, where he bore the suffering servant, bore the pain, the sin of the world. In that moment, on the cross, Jesus bore the ultimate stigma for us and died a common criminal's death. The cross is a symbol of Jesus' suffering and death. The cross is a reminder that our God knows what it is like to be judged and rejected by society, and that he voluntarily embraced this experience to make us whole. For this very reason, the Christian church has historically used a specific term to refer to the appearance of wounds corresponding to those Jesus received at the crucifixion. These wounds that sometimes people have, that Jesus had in John's Gospel, that Thomas wanted to touch, these wounds are called stigmata. Stigma? Stigmata? In himself, the risen Christ carried the wounds, afflictions, injuries, and stigma of our pain before and even after he rose from death. He knows the pain of our lives, and he promised to transform that pain into new life.